Hey everyone, Spicy Toast Gaming here with a really awesome video for you that should help you in future monthly challenges. First though, just want to shout out all my awesome members. Thank you for your continued support. It's a great encouragement to me and keeps me here making videos for all of you. If you want to become a member and support the channel, hit that join button down below and let's get into it. Now I'm going to be going through all of the different challenges, breaking down the modifiers or mutators, and letting you know what champions you should consider and which ones you should avoid. I'll also be going through and showing what champions I use to defeat all the stages, and I'm really hoping that this video is able to help you in future monthly challenges so that when you see a modifier and you're not sure how to deal with it, you can remember this video and hopefully some of my suggestions will be able to help you out. Alright, so up first for the first challenge, we have no looking back. While the player has no cards in their hand, their units have 2/2. Now this one isn't really worth trying to go for because this effect is only while you have no cards. This isn't granting your units like 2/2 when you run out of cards. As soon as you have another card in your hand, this buff just goes away. And if you have no cards, you have no options for whatever the enemy throws at you. So in general, I would not try to benefit from this power. But if you want to potentially benefit from it, the discard decks will obviously work the best because they can discard cards from their hand and try to get down to that 0 cards. So ones like Jinx, Neela, and in some regards Echo can all discard cards to try to reduce their hand and potentially benefit from this. For me, I went and used Echo for this challenge. Next up then, we have Wailing Spirits. Each round the player's first Shadow Isle card costs 1 less to play. So obviously just play Shadow Isles. And then only the strong. Kill all units except each player's strongest. Now this also pairs very well with Shadow Isle, so this is a great adventure for you. Other than Shadow Isle's cards, a great way to use this power is to play some of the decks that focus on their champion being their main win condition, especially ones that you're playing the champion at the very beginning of the game so they can start scaling up throughout the match. So ones like Diana, Jax, Nidalee, all of those will be great for this because they're generally going to be the strongest unit you have and your main win condition, so any of your other cards dying isn't really an issue for you. Yasuo is also decent for this since he's going to be normally your strongest unit, and then since the enemy is also suffering from this, you're going to be stunning their strongest unit every single round, and so they're going to have a very hard time trying to put pressure on you when they have less units on the board, so your stuns essentially go even further since you're stunning more of their board. For this one, I went and used Thresh and worked out quite well. Next up then, we have Merciless Marksman. So game start, all players summon a Crackshot Corsair. You see that right here. This is definitely the best for Jhin. He already has a Crackshot Corsair in his deck. And so when you summon this, you also summon the items that Jhin has on his version of the Crackshot Corsair in his deck. He also scales very well with the skills. And so Jhin, definitely the best bet here. Annie also works out quite well. And then any champions that are able to attack consistently, especially if you can attack a couple times in a round, such as Vayne, they'll all be able to benefit of this Crackshot Corsair. Now I used Jhin for this as he's definitely the best. Next up then, we have Tranquil Minds. Each round the player's first Ionia card costs 1 less to play. Very simple, just use an Ionian card. And for that I used Master Yi. Next up then, we had Lingering Shadows and Hearty Feast. So Lingering Shadows, when a unit dies, grant a random unit in that player's hand 1/1. Now this is great for, again, all of the Shadow Isles cards. Pretty much whenever you see a power that says unit dies, Shadow Isles is going to be great for that because they're often fine with their units dying. So any Shadow Isles card or deck will be great here, but also those Swarm type decks are also fine. So like Misfortune or the Poro King would also work out well here. Then for Hearty Feast, this is the biggest counter for champions that focus on removal and especially poke damage. So Misfortune, a lot of her damage is in increments of 1, so the Tough would completely block that. Nami, she does a lot of spells, but most of them only deal like 2 damage, so this is cutting that damage in half. And then even someone like Jhin or Annie, even though their spells are going to be hitting harder, this is still going to be annoying when every single unit that the enemy has is reducing down that damage by at least 1. So really any removal or poke champions, this is going to be annoying for you, so you probably want to avoid it. Now for this challenge, I used Thresh again. Now for challenge number 6, we had Chronicle of Ruin. Round start, kill all units, then revive them. And then with that, we had Strike the Set. When the foe attacks, stun the player's weakest unit. Now this one right here is really interesting, and it has a lot of gameplay implications that weren't immediately apparent, at least to me. Now, this is a round start effect, and it can interrupt and cancel some other round start effects. So don't use any champions that are either using Archangel's Staff or the Grand General's counterplan, because both of those are round start effects and they don't go off consistently. So for me, at a different time, I tried Annie with one of these modifiers, and for her, the Archangel Staff and the Grand General's counterplan never went off, so essentially I had 2 dead relics. Now, there's some other round start effects that will work out. So Thresh, for example, one of his star powers buffs up your units based on the amount of friendly units that died last round. So it kind of pairs perfectly for this since all of your units are dying. And for Thresh, the round start effect did still go off, buffing up your full board, but some other round start effects, such as Relic, do not go off. So again, this is a power that's focusing on killing units, so all the Shadow Isles champions are decent here, but again, avoid all champions that focus on round start relics. And in addition to this, this kind of works like everyone on the board has rejuvenating, because when your units die and get revived, they get revived back to their baseline power set. So if a unit had like 9 health and you got them down to 1 health, when they're revived back with that 9 health. So based on what other modifiers you have, you might not want to go for some champions that try to wear down their enemy slowly, because that's not going to happen here. You either have to kill the unit in the round, or they're just going to be revived with full health. Now this also works with buffs. If you have a lot of buffs on your champion, when they get killed and revived, they're going to go back to their baseline power. So this power actually counters a lot of different builds. So you probably want to avoid champions that focus on buffing up their units, such as Bard, and potentially ones even like Kayn or Garen, because all the buffs that you're creating are going to get reset. For this power though, I would highly recommend using Thresh, as he gets massive benefits from all of his units dying every single round, and he makes this adventure very easy and is the best counter I've seen for it so far. Now, strike the set when the foe attacks stun the player's weakest unit. Very straightforward, and you just need to be aware of this. If you're running a control deck that has stuns or frostbites, you can often keep the enemy from attacking, but this isn't that big of a deal. Just make sure you don't have a board that is small with only like a couple units, so that you still always have some to block for you. Now for that challenge, I went ahead and used Thresh. Next up then, we had Trick of the Light. All players summon a Mirror Mage. So you see that right here. This is focusing on created cards. When you play a created follower, summon an exact copy. When you play a created spell, copy it with these same targets. So this is great for any of your decks that are obviously creating cards. So very good for like Echo. Also can be good for Nico, especially if you're running Nico with Grand General's counterplan, because when you disguise her, every round you're going to be creating a copy of that disguised unit. And so then when you play it, it'll get doubled up since it'll count as a created card. But then also the people that are creating spells every round, such as Vhagar or Annie, or even Jin's created removal spells as well, all of those will be getting doubled, and so all of those are solid options for this power. For Age of Conquest, when the foe's units attack, grant their strongest attacking unit 2 power. So a pretty simple and straightforward one. Either try to stop the foe from attacking, or just be ready for their unit to get slightly stronger. Not that big of a deal, and one you should be able to work around with any champion. Now for this challenge, I also used Echo. Next up then, we had Fortifying Frost. Each round the player's first Freljord card costs 1 less to play, and Adorbis. Now Adorbis, you've seen this many times from the weekly adventures. Fortifying Frosts, obviously just play Freljord. For Adorbis, this only targets followers, so either go for a deck that's focused on your champion, or just make sure you have a wide enough board that one of your units getting silenced isn't the end of the world. Now this is a fairly common one. Most people should know how to play around this, but again, only targets followers, so either rely on your champions or just have a wide board. For this adventure, I used Gnar. Next up then, we had Animated Armor. All units have Formidable. And then Big Feast when the foe summons a unit, granted 3 health. And this one can be a bit tough, but what I've found is champions that have any sort of removal or damage can hard counter this and work out very well. since your removal spells will essentially count like Enfeebling Strike, since as you're reducing down their health, you're also reducing down their power. So champions that have a lot of removal or just damage, such as Annie or Vhagar, are great for this, especially Vhagar since you're making those darkness every single round, so you can constantly be reducing down the enemy and making sure they are not a threat. So whenever you see the animated armor all units have formidable, Annie, Jhin, Vhagar, all of those will be very good for this. Also, Yasuo is a solid option. One, the stuns can make it so they can't really attack you very well, but then also every time you're stunning a unit, he is either striking them or hitting them for 2 damage, again just reducing down their power. Don't try to go toe to toe with this. Don't go like Tahm Kench or maybe someone like Garen. You're gonna have a hard time outscaling this. Whittling them down with damage instead and poking them out is very strong. Also, a solid option is potentially trying to have more of a swarm style playstyle, so you always have blockers and can try to wear down their health pools, since every time you block you will be reducing their health, thereby reducing their future damage. However, that one can be pretty hit or miss, because if you try to go for a swarm playstyle such as like Misfortune, trying to just always block them, if they have something like Overwhelm or Regenerating, that will really counter your strategy of trying to wear them down. In general though, anytime you see animated armor, all units have formidable. I found that just going for champions that have some removal spells or a lot of damage are able to deal great here, especially ones that also have CC, so a nice stun works quite well. So Yasuo, Annie, those targeted stuns work out quite well. Big Feast, this is one you normally can ignore, but it can be very powerful when paired with other effects such as this. For this adventure, I did it with Tahm Kench and I would not recommend it. I was able to get through it and win, but it was much more difficult than I figured, and I would not do this again in the future. Up next then, we have Mortal Marks. When any player summons a unit, set its health to 1, and then Noxian Entertainment, game start, the foe summons a Noxcrea Arena. So Mortal Marks, this is one that you can try to outscale, so going for someone like Leona or potentially Bard where you're able to scale your units up. However, that can really get countered quite easily by the enemy, and they can easily take out your units before you're able to scale up. So while you can try to deal with that, it's not amazing. However, having removal on your side as well can be very strong, since the enemy is also getting set to 1 health, so any damage will be able to take them out fairly easily. Nami is actually pretty solid here because she has a decent amount of removal, so she can try to take out the enemies consistently, but she also has ways to buff up her own units, so she's kind of a good mix of the both, buffing your units and being able to take out enemy threats. Since your units are going to be so fragile, it's good to have a fairly wide board and potentially go for a Shadow Isles deck, since your units are going to die. So someone especially like Thresh would be solid here, because his own units dying then helps scale up his other units. Also, it can be a solid idea to go for decks that don't really rely on their units being big, they rely on other win conditions. So someone like Jhin, where you are able to scale up your whole board from your spells and skills, but at the same time, you're more relying on people for their effects, not for their stat pools. So Jhin and potentially Annie are other ones that you're relying on units for what they do, not necessarily just their stat pools, and so they'd still be able to get their main effects off even while being reduced down. Now the arena, round end, your player's strongest ally strikes the weakest enemy. So this is on the opponent's board, so their strongest unit is going to strike your weakest enemy. So either having units that you're fine with them dying, so like Kindred with her prey, they're just going to be essentially the sacrificial lamb for you. Or if possible, you can try to make it so your weakest unit is still going to be strong enough to take out the enemy unit, so you can actually turn this in your favor in some situations, but that's going to rely on you being able to buff up your own units. So scaling decks will potentially be able to take this and use it to their advantage, especially where you might have very few units, and you're relying on like one very strong champion, because then your only unit is technically your weakest, but it's stronger than any of theirs, so this kind of counts as free removal. So for this arena, you either want to go very wide with your board, so you have units that you're fine with them dying, or you want to go very narrow with your board so that your weakest unit is still very strong and stronger than anything the opponent has. So some of the decks that just focus on their champion, again such as Jax, Diana, Nidalee, they would be able to take advantage of this. Now for this adventure, I did it with Leona, and I wouldn't really recommend it. So I tried to go for the scaling route of being able to scale up my whole board. It did work eventually, but it took a long time and was a game I easily could have lost. If I had to do it again, I would probably go for either one of the Shadow Isles champions or someone like Jin instead. Leona, it worked, but wouldn't recommend it for the future. Next up then, a lot of modifiers here. So guided meditation, game start, all players start with 10 mana gems. This is very good for a lot of different champions. One, all the champions that use Chemtech Duplicator. This is amazing, and you can often dominate the game because you're getting all your spells doubled right away. Lux, Vhagar, Set, Nami, just all those champions that like Chemtech Duplicator can immediately benefit from this. Also, there's a lot of very fun builds you can do for champions that normally they're too expensive to play. So like Ornn or Darius, being able to drop them turn 1 can often swing the game into your favor. Unflinching Strength, each round the player's first Noxus card costs 1 less to play. That's very straightforward. On the case, the foe's units have Nexus Strike, plant 1 Flash Bomb trap in the top 8 cards of the player's deck. So pretty simple, you just, again, want to make sure the enemies aren't hitting your Nexus if at all possible. So either making sure you have blockers or trying to have some CC to make it so they can't attack and hit your Nexus. And then Death is like the Wind. When the player plays their first unit each round, stun it. So this one is annoying, but really you can deal with this for just about anyone. The only champion this really counters is Leona, since you want to be playing your champion to get your Daybreak effect. Other than that though, this is something you can just play around on any champion. For this run though, I went ahead and used Darius and went with a very aggressive build on him, giving him some more stats, Crown Guard Inheritance, and Gatebreaker, so he was able to hit the board, immediately swing, hit their Nexus, try to level up, rally, and end the game. Worked out quite well. Next up then, we have Dune Striders. Each round the player's first Shurima card costs 1 less to play. Very straightforward. Monkey Munitions. When the foe attacks, they summon a Flame Chompers, challenging the player's strongest unit. So this one is really just annoying. You want to make sure you have a wide enough board that you'll still be able to have blockers, since your strongest unit is constantly going to be dragged aside. However, you can make this work for you. So if you go with someone like Kayn, where you want to be killing the enemy units, since they're going to be challenging you with a Flame Chompers, your strongest unit is constantly going to be scaling up every time the enemy tries to attack you, since you're just getting free kills essentially. So try to have a wider board, and then also try to benefit from this yourself. So Kayn, Garen, able to benefit from striking and killing enemy units should be pretty solid for you. Now for this one, I went with Talia, since it had that reduced cost of Shurima cards. Next up then, we have the Price of Progress. The player's spells cost 2 less, their units cost 1 more. So this obviously great for all of the spells based decks, especially the ones that have spells that cost 2 or less. So Annie, Jin, Nami especially, Vhagar if you don't have him at 3 stars yet. All of those will be really solid, and if you normally are using Archangel Staff as part of your build, you can potentially take that out and swap it out for something else, as you probably aren't going to need your Archangel Staff, since most of your spells are going to be free anyways. So any spells based deck. Also, Master Yi and Lee Sin benefit from this fairly well, because both of them are again creating spells that normally cost mana, and now that they're free, they can really dominate. Especially Master Yi, he can go infinite because he has a infinite combo already in his kit. As long as you run Grand General's Counterplan on him, you can consistently get that off every round. Normally the only limiter is your mana, but those spells cost less than 2 mana, so you can just be able to play them forever, winning the game very early. For the other power, Survival of the Fittest. Round start, obliterate the foe's weakest unit to grant double its stats to the foe's strongest. Now, if you're not careful, this can really scale up out of control. Going for some units that have strong removal, especially removal that doesn't care about the unit's stats, so it's not based on doing damage. So like Annie, if you use your Disintegrate, then as long as you deal 1 damage to them, it kills them regardless of their health. That can be very strong to do on their unit that's getting all these stats. Or someone like Kindred, where they have a lot of removal that's just kill the unit, doesn't matter their stats. Some of those champions can really handle these very large units that might occur with Survival of the Fittest. Now for that challenge, I went ahead and used Nami, and yep, worked very well. Next up then, Guided Meditation. We already went over this one, and that's going to happen with a lot of these powers that we will have already talked about. But game start, all players start the game with 10 mana gems. So again, Chemtech Duplicator or some of those bigger champions work very well here. And then nothing but Powder Monkeys. Round start, if the foe has the attack token, they summon a Powder Monkey. So you see that right here. Small unit, but last breath deal 1 to the enemy nexus. So just make sure you're ending the game fairly quickly so that these monkeys aren't able to wear you down too much. Having some sustain might be decent, but not overly necessary. You should be able to end the game before this ever really is a problem. But if you wanted a little bit of extra sustain, wouldn't hurt. So someone like Gwen, Nami, or Tom Kench all have some decent amount of healing for their Nexus. Now for this one, I did Lee Sin because he can work very well with Chemtech Duplicator, and he was able to end the game in like 1 round. Next up then, all spells cost 1 less. All units have Spell Shield. So this is similar to the last power we touched on based on spells. That one had the negative effect of making your units cost 1 more, but here all your spells costing 1 less. Again, great for all those spells based champions, and I find it is especially good for Master Yi, as him having Spell Shield is very strong, but then having all your spells cost 1 less, he's able to buff himself up to a crazy amount and can end games very quickly. But again, all the spells based champions we mentioned before will work here as well. Now Fortification, the foe nexus is tough. This is just going to be a counter for champions that do that little bit of poke damage. So Nami, Misfortune, they often can hit the nexus with just a little bit of damage, and this is going to be countering them for that. Try to have bigger units that are able to hit harder, going for a swarm sort of playstyle where all your units are hitting the nexus just for small amounts of damage. That will really be reduced by this power. So again, going for like Misfortune, probably not the best idea here. Most of the champions though will be fine with this. For this power, I did go for Master Yi, and yes, it worked out very well. Next up, Dying Laughing, all players summon a Phantom Prankster. So when an ally dies, deal 1 to the enemy nexus. Again, great for all those Shadow Isles champions because they're all fine with their own units dying, or going for a more swarm playstyle such as Misfortune or Poro King, where again, you're fine with your own units dying. Also going for someone like Annie, where you have some very strong removal. Again, with that Disintegrate, you can quickly take out the enemy Phantom Prankster so you don't have to worry about it. Same with Kindred. Their mark will normally target the Phantom Prankster since it has 0 power. So again, you can get it off the board fairly quickly so you just don't have to worry about the enemy slowly wearing down your Nexus. Next up, then we had Vanguard Lookout. Game start, the foe summons 2 Vanguard Lookouts. So you see that right here. These aren't going to be able to do a lot of damage to you, but they will be solid blockers. Not something you really need to build around. You just need to be aware of the enemy is going to have 2 units at the start of the game. Now for this one, I went ahead and used Kindred, and yes, it worked out quite well. Next up then, the Price of Progress. We already talked about this one earlier. Again, your spells cost 2 less, the player's units cost 1 more. All those spells based champions, very solid. Although I guess one champion we did forget to mention before was Varus. And then Fixer Upper, round start, give the foe's weakest unit 3/3 this round. So if possible, you're going to want to remove the enemy's board essentially. If you can, consistently just kill all their units. So even if that means not focusing on the Nexus as much, so using Challenger Vulnerable to try to grab their units and kill them, or using some removal spells. Again, pretty much any champion will be able to deal with this. You just have to be intentional with how you're playing and always making it a priority to kill the enemy units if possible, even over dealing damage to the enemy Nexus, unless you can actually kill the Nexus with that attack. Also, you can go for some of the control decks to be able to deal with some of their units as they're getting stronger. So Yasuo, Ashe, or Annie. There are other control decks as well, but any of them should be able to deal with the opponent's units. If they look like too much of a threat, you can use your CC and deal with them. Now for this one, I went ahead and used Varus. He has a lot of cheap spells, so being able to play them for free worked out quite well. Next up then, we had Dying Laughing. We've already talked about this a couple times. The Phantom Prankster right here, and then Mana Flow. Game start, the foe gets a mana gem. Now for this, you just want to not play any slow decks because the enemy has their game plan just getting sped up. Also, you can see here that it was Aurelia, so really you just want to go for decks that are stronger in the early game and not ones that are going to scale up later. So Samira would be a solid option here, as she can put a lot of pressure on early, which means she can try to deal with a lot of pressure the enemy's doing. Same with like Nidalee, very aggressive early. Misfortune, Kindred, they're able to fill out a lot of units on their boards. They have a lot of blockers available. You just really want to avoid those slower champions such as Ornn or Nasus that take a while to get going because they will get hard countered by this and they'll lose the game in the first couple rounds. So just as you're looking through your champion roster, just make sure you're able to put the pressure on early otherwise you will get overrun. Now for this one, I did use Misfortune, paired well with being able to have a lot of units early, especially your summoning units every round, and that paired well with that Phantom Prankster as well. Next up then, we had Animated Armor. All the foe's units have Formidable, and Crush, they also have Overwhelm. Now for Overwhelm, the main way you want to deal with that is just having big, beefy units that can take the hits and not dying. You don't want to go for small units like Misfortune because a lot of that damage is still going to carry through. So units like Tom Kench, Garen, Kane, potentially Bard, Leona, all of those decks just have big beefy units will be able to counter Crush. As far as the Formidable, we've already talked about it. In my opinion, the best way to deal with it is just having consistent removal. Vhagar especially counters this hard in my opinion. Now for this challenge, I did clear it with Vhagar, worked out very, very well. Next up then, Natural Magic, all cards cost 2 less, and then Long Rest, the foe's units have Regenerating. So you want to be sure you're killing them, not just damaging them because they will heal up. For Natural Magic, this is pretty much going to work for everyone, but you usually want to go for some of those cheaper, more aggressive decks where you can play most of it for free and try to end the game very quickly. Again, this is also affecting the enemy, so they're going to be playing a lot of cards early. Sometimes you just need to outlast them, so they'll be playing a ton of cards, putting a lot of pressure on you, but they'll just run out of cards, and then you can really take control of the game. So if you had a little bit of a slower deck, as long as you just survive the enemy, you can outlast them. Again, you can really use this for just about anyone, but going for some of those cheaper decks like Samira, especially with her own cost reduction, can put a lot of pressure on early and try to end the game very quickly. Or also champions like Annie, you have a lot of very cheap units, so again, you'll be able to play pretty much the majority of your cards for free. And then again, the Long Rest, just make sure you're actually killing the enemy units so they're not regenerating. Now for this one, I went and used the Poro King since most of his units are pretty cheap. Next up then, Lingering Shadows. We've already touched on this. When a unit dies, grant a random unit in that player's hand 1/1. Again, great for Swarm playstyles or Shadow Isles. Strength in the Swiftness. The foe's units have Quick Attack. So this one can be annoying. Again, you just want to make sure your units are strong enough that they can take the hit and then hit back. You don't want to have units where the enemy is just constantly strong enough that they can kill your units and you can't do anything about it. So having big, strong units, or trying to focus on maybe having some CC so that you can either stun or frostbite the enemy so that if they had a unit that you just couldn't block without dying, you have another way to deal with it. So any of the champions we've talked about that have stuns or frostbites or just removal spells are ways you can deal with this. Now for this challenge, I did use Gwen, and Gwen's very, very strong, so it went perfectly fine. Next up then, we have No Looking Back. This is the first power we touched on. While the player has no cards in their hand, their units have 2/2. Not really worth trying for. And then Endure, when the foe summons a unit, grant it 1/1. So this, very simple and straightforward power, just the enemy's units are all going to be a little bit stronger. Again, a very general power you can really deal with on anyone, just something you have to be aware of the units will be a little bit tougher that you're going up against. For that one, I went ahead and used Bard, since his units could scale up and deal with the enemy. Also, I like to try to use some of the lower tier champions in the earlier challenges, so I still have more runs available with my better champions. Next up then, Dutiful Service. Each round, the player's first Demacian card costs 1 less to play. Very straightforward, just use Demacia. And then the Pilfered Provisions. Game start, the foe summons a Warlord's Palace. Right here, count down 8, create a Relic of Power in hand. And then when you target allies, advance me. So they're going to get this. They can either predict and draw 1, summon a charger, or grant allies 1/1. The vast majority of the time, they're just going to be summon a Sandstone Charger. But when it counts down to 0, they steal a mana gem from the player and summon a Warlord's Palace. So they're starting the game with one of these, and then if it actually completes, they're going to take one of your mana gems and then create another one. So this is really just putting a timer on you where you need to end the games quickly. Otherwise, they're just going to keep stealing all of your mana gems, so they're going to be able to play more cards, you're going to be able to play less. So either try to end the games quickly, or go for a champion where you're able to destroy the palace. So Kindred and Talia both have ways to destroy landmarks. And so I believe if you just destroy the palace, then you essentially remove this condition from the game. Now for this one, I used Garen because of the Demacia modifier. Next up then, Crafty Portals. Each round, the player's first Bandle City card costs 1 less to play. very simple and straightforward. Vicious Enemy, again, very general power, just making it a little bit harder. And then the Shadows Come For You. The foes have Nexus Strike, create a Shadow Fiend in hand. So another power that you just want to make sure the enemies aren't hitting your Nexus if at all possible. There's several other of these that we've talked about, and the same applies here. You just want to try to make sure you have enough blockers, and then having some way to deal with those targets that you aren't able to block, like elusives or maybe a strong overwhelm unit, so having some maybe backup CC or some strong targeted removal. A lot of ways you can deal with this. You just have to intentionally play trying to make sure the enemy can't hit your Nexus. Now for this one, I went ahead and used Teemo, trying to rush them down early. Next up then, we have Repetition. When any player plays a spell, copy it with the same targets. There's been a lot of spells-based modifiers, and so anytime you see spell, you really want to be thinking of those champions. So Master Yi, Lee Sin, Annie, Veigar, Jhin, Varus. Anytime you see a spell modifier on a Mutator, you want to be thinking of those champions and thinking of which one will best fit the situation. Next then, Chilling Prophecy. Game start, the foe summons a Frozen Thrall, set it to count down 5. So after 5 rounds, they're going to summon this big 8/8 unit. So either end the game before those 5 rounds, destroy the landmark, or have a way to deal with this unit. Not that big of a deal. A lot of champions can end the game before 5 rounds anyways, especially with having such a powerful ability such as a Repetition. Now for this one, I went ahead and used Yasuo. Not really sure why I used Yasuo for this challenge, but he's a strong champion, especially in the monthlies, and was able to come away with the win. Next up, round start, each player gets a mana gem. So this is essentially just speeding up the game because both you and the enemy are getting a mana gem. So really any champion can benefit from this. If you're trying to break out some of your more expensive ramp champions, this can help you out. But again, this is just speeding up the game. Any champion can use this. Then Suffer, deal 1 to all the players' damaged units. So this is great if you're Tahm Kench, because if you have him at 3 stars, your units gain 2/2 when they're damaged. So essentially this is just buffing up your units. It's just a positive. So really good if you're Tahm Kench. If you're anyone else, you just want to be careful with your damaged units and don't necessarily block with some of your more important ones. So if you're running like Annie or Veigar, even if they have a very small unit on the board, don't bother blocking. You don't want your units to get damaged and slowly whittled down round after round. Now, if you have some consistent sustain, like if you're running Nami, she could heal up her units, so they no longer have to deal with this. But really, this is a pretty general power you can deal with on any champion, or you can benefit from if you're Tahm Kench. Now, for this one, I used Tahm Kench, obviously, and it worked out very well. Next up then, we have Embrace the Current. When the player plays a spell, they refill 1 spell mana. Again, you're seeing spell, so you should immediately be thinking Annie, Jhin, Nami, Varus, Lee Sin, Master Yi. All of these will work out well. When you're playing a spell, you're getting 1 mana back. Anytime you see spell, immediately think of those champions and think who is going to work best for the situation with the other modifiers here. So next, Distracting Melody. Round start, a random card in the player's hand costs 2 more this round. So again, a pretty general power, and one that's just going to be slightly annoying, but one you can deal with on essentially any champion. Now for this one, I went ahead and used Lee Sin. Part of that is because I saw the boss was Karma. That means you're also going to be getting 10 mana in the final round, because that's Karma's power. Both people start with that 10 mana. And so having Lee Sin with that 10 mana using Chemtech Duplicator, and then also having that spell-based power worked out very well. Up next then, we have Blinking Flames. All spells and skills deal 1 extra damage. Now again, you see spells, so you should be thinking about all those champions, but then while you're thinking about them, be like, okay, a lot of those champions, they don't deal damage. They're spells like Master Yi or Lee Sin that are based on buffing up your own units. So you see spells, and then you rule some of them out because they don't have damage. They have different types of spells. But then the other champions, so Annie, Jhin, Nami, they all have damaging spells, and so they'll work out great for this. And then pop goes the Puff Cap. Round start, plant a poison Puff Cap in the player's deck. So we all know what Puff Caps do. This is just putting a bit of a timer on you, so you need to end the game before this kills you. Alright, for that challenge, I used Misfortune. Now with Misfortune, you can build her as a spells-based champion, especially if you run Luden's Tempest and Grand General's Counterplan. So she was actually able to benefit from this power fairly strong, as all of your spells and skills deal 1 extra damage, is essentially doubling Misfortune's damage. Alright, next up then, Fortifying Frost, talked about this earlier, just play Freljord cards. And then Mush, when the foe attacks, they summon a attacking random 1-cost Poro. So again, a pretty basic power that you can play around with anyone. Some things to think about though. You might want to use the Voidborn Carapace because those Poros are going to have random keywords. When you kill them, those keywords will then go on your champion. So that could be a solid option. Also, a random 1-cost Poro. It's going to be pretty easy to kill in most situations. So going for a champion like Tom Kench or Kane, they can both benefit from that 1-cost Poro, either taking a little bit of damage and killing it, helping them scale up. So pretty general power, but some ways you can benefit from this. Now for that challenge, I did go with the Poro King. Next up then, Mortal Marks. When any player summons units, set its health to 1. Again, touched on this earlier. You can play champions that are fine with their own units dying because that's going to happen here. Try to go for champions with removal to take out the enemy units as soon as they play them. Try to play a champion with some scaling to scale up your own units, or just play champions where they're playing their units for their effect, not for their stats. A lot of different ways you can approach this. Raiding Party, when the foe damages the player's Nexus, grant the top unit in the foe's deck 1/1. So you just want to make sure the foe can't damage your Nexus. So the main way they're able to do this is by attacking, so just make sure you're blocking and making sure they're not hitting your Nexus. Now they might have some other spells and skills that also hit your Nexus, but for the most part you're not going to be able to stop those. So the biggest thing here, just make sure you're blocking so the enemy can't get those free hits in and buff up their top deck. Alright, for this one I went ahead and used Jinx just to, blow through it. Next up then, Price of Progress. We've already touched on this several times at this point. The player's spells cost 2 less, their units cost 1 more. You see spells, think about all those spells-based champions, and just try to determine which one fits this situation best. Then beyond mere flesh, the foe's units have 1/1 for each of their keywords. So the foe's units are going to be stronger and potentially scaling up throughout the match, because often this is paired with very annoying champions such as Victor, where they can just keep scaling up. Normally this means your games have a bit of a timer and you need ways to deal with strong enemy units. So either having some CC or removal. This can definitely be a pretty tough power. Alright, for this challenge, I used Master Yi. Again, pairs very well with that one power we mentioned. Next up then we have Butcher's Block. All units have Plunder, grant me 1/1. So again, a power you can pretty much just ignore. Yes, you'll be able to benefit from it a little bit, so going for champions that are able to get Plunder effects off very easily, such as Jinx, Misfortune, Gnar. You will be able to scale up your units a little bit, but it's pretty negligible. Again, the enemy can benefit from this as well, but again, pretty negligible, not something you really need to worry about. Power overwhelming though, round end, grant the foe's units 1/1. So the biggest thing here is just trying to consistently kill your enemy's units. So that needs to be your top priority. Again, often overhitting the Nexus, you want to be taking out their units instead. So pretty much every champion has ways to take out enemy units, whether it's removal spells, challenger, vulnerable. This is really one where you want to be focusing on your playstyle and just focusing on killing the enemy over anything else, because if you don't kill them, they're just going to keep getting bigger and bigger, and eventually it will be a problem. Now for this one, I used Gnar to somewhat benefit from that first power a little bit. Next up then we have Game Start, all players summon 2 Funsmiths. So the Funsmith, all your spells and skills deal 1 extra damage. So you see spells, immediately thinking about all those champions we've talked about so many times. And again, this one is about damage, so you're ruling out all the champions that are just about buffing up their own units, so Master Yi, Varus, Lee Sin. And so you want to be focusing on like Nami, Annie, Jin. All of those will be really solid here. Also Misfortune. But then after image, round start, the foe revives a ephemeral copy of the strongest dead follower. So every single round, the enemy is going to get just a free ephemeral copy of whatever the strongest dead follower was. Not the strongest follower last round, not your strongest dead follower necessarily, it's just whatever the strongest follower in the game was, the enemy gets that every single round. That obviously will be a very powerful effect, so you just need to try to be ending the game very quickly. And again, focusing more on your other win conditions other than your units. So in this situation, you have these 2 Funsmiths. Use this, try to rush down the game as soon as you can. So playing someone that has some Nexus damage that can be scaled up. So in this situation, Annie would be very good. Also Ephemerals, CC is very strong on them because if you stun them, you essentially kill them. because they're going to die at the end of the round anyways. In other situations with this power, you want to be careful to not play too strong of dead followers, because if you play a really OP follower, the enemy's going to get it. So potentially you want to focus more on your champion and not your units. So in other situations, you'd maybe want to go for, like, again, Jax, Diana, Nidalee, all those decks where the champion is the main focus, because this is reviving followers, not units. But again, for this situation, you just want to focus on your spells and nuking the Nexus as fast as possible. So for this, I went ahead and used Annie. Very strong champion and has a lot of that burn damage. Next up then, Dying Laughing, game start. All players summon the Phantom Prankster. We've already talked on this many times. Hemorrhage, round end, deal 1 to the player's Nexus for each unit the foe has. So another power that you can somewhat ignore if you have a fast enough deck. If you know you can rush down the enemy faster than they can kill you, then you can somewhat ignore this. If you're playing a little bit of a slower deck, then you need to be focusing on taking out the enemy units so your Nexus doesn't get worn down. But again, if you're playing some of those faster blitz decks, such as like Nidalee or Jax, you can just focus on nuking down the Nexus and not dealing with the enemy, because you know the little damage they're dealing every round isn't going to be enough. But slower decks, focus on killing enemy units, otherwise you will slowly bleed out. Now for this one, I use Kindred, benefit from that first power. Next up, we have No Looking Back. When the player has no cards in their hand, their units have 2/2. Touched on this many times, not really worth trying to go for. Vicious Enemy, very simple, just makes everything slightly harder. And then Withstand. Round start, grant the foe's units 1 health. So one where you potentially want to worry about killing their enemies, but honestly, these are all pretty general powers that don't really force you to play any specific champion, just any champion that's strong enough to deal with the enemy. So nothing too crazy here. Yes, it's making the game harder, but not really in any specific enough way. This is the type of monthly challenge where you don't really look at the powers, you look at the bosses, and you try to best counter them. The powers are just making everything a little bit harder. So for this one, went with Jinx just to blow through it. Next up then, Chronicle of Ruin. We did touch on this extensively before. Kill all units and revive them. The Shadow Isle decks are all going to be fine with this. They all do very well with their own units dying. But since this is a round start effect, it can counter some of your other round start effects. So any relics you're using that have round start effects, such as Grand General's Counterplan or Archangel, this often screws them up so they don't go off. Also, this counts as essentially a reset and revive. So if you don't kill a unit, they're going to be revived with full health again. And then if you buff up your own unit a bunch, when they get revived, all those buffs are going to be gone. So this one can counter a lot of game plans. I find it's really best to go for someone like Thresh, as he scales very well with this. Welcome to the Murder Bridge. This one actually is very much a pain. I underestimated my first time. Game start, the foe summons the Howling Abyss. So round start, create in hand a random level 2 champion that's not in hand, deck, or play. Now, this one is very random since you don't know what champion they're going to get, but the fact that the champion is already leveled up is really an issue, because if the foe just gets lucky, then you're going to have a real bad time. So for me, the foe summoned a level 2 Twisted Fate. Level 2 Twisted Fate is very powerful. And then they also summoned a lot of very big champions, which I couldn't consistently kill in a single round, so they constantly got essentially healed and revived by the Chronicle of Ruin. So this one really is a pain. If you see this, I suggest either breaking out one of your really strong champions, or try to go for a champion that has a way to deal with landmarks, so like Kindred or Talia, so you can just destroy this landmark and don't have to deal with any anymore. This one puts a major timer on your game, so you either want to rush down the enemy very quickly or destroy this landmark, because normally you will get overwhelmed just by the amount of leveled champions the enemy is playing. Now for this one, I used Jinx to again just blast my way through it. Next up then, Unflinching Strength. Each round the player's first Noxus card costs 1 less to play. Very straightforward, play Noxus. Withstand, round start, grant the foe's units 1 health. Again, pretty basic power that you can really deal with on anyone. You just want to make sure the enemy's not scaling up too strong. So you may want to focus at times on killing enemy units, but in general, a power you can kind of ignore and deal with on anyone. So for that one, I use Samira. Next up then, the Salty Dogs. Each round, the player's first Bilgewater card costs 1 less to play. Very simple, play Bilgewater. Big Feast, when the foe summons unit granted 3 health. So again, a power that's going to make things a little bit more difficult, but you can really deal with it on just about anyone. Yes, all their units are going to be hard to kill, which is annoying, but again, something you can really play around on any champion. So for this one, I used Alawi. Next up then, Tranquil Winds. Each round, the player's first Ionia card cost 1 less to play. So again, very simple, straightforward, just play Ionia. Vicious Enemy, just makes everything harder. And then Big Feast, when the foe summons a unit granted that 3 health. Again, just making it a little bit harder, but a power you can deal with on pretty much anyone. Really, in the modifiers, there's some powers that actually change the way you're going to need to play. And then there's other modifiers, which in most situations don't really change how you play in the sense that it's going to change who you pick. It's just going to make things slightly harder. So essentially you kind of ignore them and just deal with them in game. They don't actually really factor into how you're selecting your champion. So both Vicious Enemy and Big Feast are generally that in most situations. You just want to make sure you have a strong enough champion to deal with it. Now for that one, I used Set since it was Ionia. Next up then, Unflinching Strength, just play Noxus. And then Prophet of an Elder God. When the foe attacks, spawn 3. So that spawn, they're going to be making that tentacle and then buffing it up per each rank of spawn. So pretty straightforward power. Really, you just need to have a way to deal with this. So if you have one of the CC decks, you probably want to use your CC on that tentacle. If you have a removal deck, you probably just want to be consistently killing this before it gets too big. So it's going to make the match a little bit harder, and it will slightly change how you play in game, but doesn't really need to change how you actually pick in your champion. Just have to be aware of it and don't let the enemy use it to defeat you. Now for that one, I used Darius. Next up then, Forest Workout. All units have strike, double my power, and then Chorus of Power. Round start, the foe gets an extra mana gem this round for each unit they have. So this obviously is going to be a very difficult power. You want to be killing the enemy units if at all possible, but honestly, I would focus on just trying to end the game as quickly as you can, which you can do from the Forest Workout. So whenever I see this now, I immediately think Diana. If you have Diana and you have Gale Force, use it here, you will one-shot the Nexus. So all units, yours and the enemies, have strike, double my power. You want to be making sure the enemy isn't scaling it up and trying to get strikes off for your own units. So any units or any champions, if you're not going to play Diana, that have strike relics that you can put on, so like Darius or Kayn, that will work very well. You can play them, have them strike 2 or even 3 times. But yeah, in general, if you have a leveled up Diana and you have Gale Force, this is just an easy win, because with Diana, you get double attack. So when she attacks, she's striking twice. And then if you're using Gale Force, she can attack twice. So essentially you're striking 4 times. And every time you're striking, you're doubling your power. So yeah, you play Diana with her one-shot build and she will one-shot the enemy Nexus. It's crazy. Always recommend it whenever you see this power. So for this one, I actually used Nidalee. Worked out fine. Nidalee's a very solid champion. Did that to try to get rid of the Chorus of Power. And this was before I figured out that Diana absolutely destroys with this. Next up then, Empire Above All. So round end, grant all units 2 power. Then you have the Undying Rage. We've all seen this a million times from the weeklies. Very annoying. For Empire Above All, you just want to generally have a wide board so you have more units benefiting from this at all possible. But honestly, it is kind of a nothing power. Like, it's one you can easily ignore and still win the game. Really, you just want to be focusing that the enemy isn't getting this power over getting the power yourself necessarily. So trying to take out the enemy units, which can be very annoying from the Undying Rage. So having champions that have just overwhelming amounts of removal, such as Kindred with the double Stalker's Blade and Guardian Angel, she normally can just absolutely annihilate because she's striking and killing so many times. But yeah, Undying Rage, a lot of ways to deal with this. Try to go around the enemies with like elusives, try to go through the enemies with like overwhelm, or just have overwhelming removal where you can still kill all the enemy units, even though you have to do it 1 extra time with the extra life they get from Undying. Also note that your units gain this extra power. I don't believe that actually counts towards Bard leveling up, since it's essentially a outside effect doing it. You don't get credit for it. Now for this challenge, I used Nico and was able to come away with the win there. Next up then, Tranquil Minds. Each round the player's first Ionia card costs 1 less. Again, just play Ionia. Big Feast, we've already seen this many other times before. And again, just a power that's making things a little bit more difficult, not really influencing how you're going to play. For that one, I used Yasuo. Next up then, Mountain Peak. Game start, the foe summons a Targon's Peak. Round end, all players draw 1. So that Targon's Peak, round start, reduce the cost of a random card in all players' hands to 0 this round. Then we have Let's Rock. Round start, the foe summons a Rockfall Path if they don't have one. So Rockfall Path, countdown 2, obliterate the weakest enemy. So essentially what you want to be doing is making sure you have sacrificial units that the Rockfall Path can obliterate. So if you're playing someone like Kindred, you're going to have a prey on the board that you're just fine with it dying. So just trying to make sure you always have a unit that you're fine with it dying and that you don't let this kill your more important units. Now, the Mountain's Peak, this is something that I normally don't try to play around myself. Yes, it's going to reducing down cards in your hand, but I don't necessarily recommend trying to go with a really big, slow deck and just hope you win the lottery with your big unit getting hit. I personally wouldn't recommend that. I'd rather go for the consistency of just having a solid deck and then every round, oh, something got reduced down. If you want to go for some of your bigger, slower decks and just try to win the lottery, you can do that. I normally don't bother. The Let's Rock though, this is normally something that's just putting a timer on your games because you're constantly losing units to this. So you really want to be ending the game as fast as possible. Now there are some champions where this won't really matter since you're creating ephemeral units every round for free, or you're creating a prey every round for free. In general though, with these two, I just try to end the game as fast as possible. And that's generally how I think the best way to deal with these are. So for this one, I went with Diana just to try to end the game very quickly. Next then, Unflinching Strength. Talked about that a whole bunch already, just play Noxus. Iterative Enhancements, round start, the foe summons the next turret. So there's a bunch of turrets with all different costs from 0 to 8, and so it's just going to keep progressively summoning stronger and stronger units. Once it gets to the 8 mana one, it's just an 8 mana 8/8. So all this is really doing is just putting a timer on your game, so you just have to try to end the game before you get overwhelmed with turrets. So for this one, I went with LeBlanc. Next up then, Breakthrough Research. Each round the player's first Piltover and Zon card costs 1 less to play, so just play a P&Z deck. And then Undying Rage. We've all seen this. We all know how to deal with it. It's annoying, but we've all seen it so many times at this point. For this one, I went and used Janna. Next up then, Wailing Spirits. Each round the player's first Shadow Isle card costs 1 less to play, so just play a Shadow Isles card. And then Sovereign's Domination. So this is also Viego's power. The foe summons a ephemeral copy of the player's strongest follower that died last round. So really, you just don't want to have your followers dying. And if you do have followers dying, you want to make sure they're not something that's particularly strong. Now, often with this, you're going to want to avoid playing cards that are summoning ephemeral units because they're going to die every round, and then the enemy is going to get them every round. So normally avoid playing this with like Gwen or Misfortune. Now for this one, I used Elise. Next up then, Lingering Shadows. We've talked on this many times. Swarm deck or Shadow Isles. Vicious Enemy just makes everything harder. Then Demacian Might 2. When an ally strikes, grant it 2/2. Now this one was a little confusing for me because it didn't say whether it was for us or for the enemy. Normally it says like right here, when the foe attacks. This one didn't say player or foe, so I was kind of confused. This one's only helping the enemy. I tried to play Garen here, didn't get the extra bonuses. So just if you see this, they need to work on the wording, but this one is just for the enemy. So the enemy units are going to be scaling up if they're getting strikes off and not dying. Now that one can be pretty tough. Again, trying to focus on just CCing the enemy with some frostbites or stuns so they can't get their strikes off. Trying to use removal to just kill the enemy targets, or just trying to have strong enough units to deal with this so that when the enemy strikes you, they're going to be dying when you hit them back. So again, a lot of different ways you can deal with this. Pretty broad power, but one that's quite strong and only for the enemy, sadly. And then Prophet of an Elder God. When the foe attacks, spawn 3. So again, pretty general power, something that you want to be making sure it doesn't get out of control. But really with these, it's just putting a timer on you because the enemy is constantly going to be getting free stats and free units. So really when you see something like this, you just want to break out a strong champion and you just want to blast through this as fast as possible. So for this one, I used Nidalee. I think I actually ended up losing this my first time because I tried to use Garen because I thought that this would work for both us and the enemy. Fortunately, that's not the way it worked. So then I broke out Nidalee and just blasted through. Next then, Tranquil Minds. Very simple, just play Ionia card. Then Gathering Storm. When the foe attacks, stun the weakest unit and the foe draws 1. So just a more powerful version of a card that a power we've seen before. If you can, keep the enemy from attacking, so either stun or frostbite them, or just try to remove them, or just try to have a wide board so that if they attack, they're stunning one of your less important cards, and you still have other cards that can block for you. So for this one, I went ahead and used Set. Next up then, Savage Mysticism. Round start, each player summons a mana gem. Touched on this before. All this is really doing is speeding up the game. So if you are using a cheaper deck, you can probably end faster. If you're using a more expensive deck, you'll just be able to play your cards faster. Since this is affecting both you and the enemy, all it's really doing is speeding everything up. Fan favorite, round start, give the foe's strongest unit 2 power and overwhelm this round. So while this is a pretty general power that you can deal with on anyone, it is something you really need to be aware of because that overwhelm can ruin your day. You want to be sure you have a way to deal with that, whether that's, again, CCing them with stun or frostbite, removing them, or just making sure your units have enough health that they can block that overwhelm. If you see this, you probably want to move away from some of those swarm decks that have very weak units, so you probably don't want to play someone like Misfortune. But in general, a lot of different ways to deal with this. It's just a power you need to be aware of going into and have a plan for. Now for this one, I used Janna. Next up then, Bandle Magic. Game start, the player summons a Bandle tree. So round start, create a follower from a new region in hand. Then if I've seen allies from 10 or more regions, win the game. So this is an alternative win condition that you could try to use. Now this will be decent for some of those World Walker champions where they have units from many different regions. So using any of those here, if you want to try to win from this, they would be a good option. The Poro King would also be very solid for this because you're able to generate more Poros. Poros are very cheap. Also, we have Evelyn generating her different husks, which are from the different regions. So that could work out decently well. But yeah, if you're trying to win for this, probably go for the Poro King. In general, though, I would probably just try to win normally. But if you want to go for this, there are some champions that can benefit from this. Then we have the Vicious Enemy. We've all seen that before. Nothing but Powder Monkeys rank 2. So now round start, the foe summons a Powder Monkey. Just every round. Before it was just when they had the attack token. Again, this is just the enemy getting free units and free Nexus damage. So you just want to make sure you're not getting overwhelmed, but this is putting a bit of a timer on you since it's damaging your Nexus every single round. Then Hemorrhage, round end, deal 1 to the player's Nexus for each unit the foe has. So again, another power that's kind of putting a clock on the game, because you won't be able to kill every enemy the opponent has every round. That's why when I see this, I'm just going to try to rush down the enemy, because if you're trying to go for the Bandle tree, you have 2 powers working against you. They're just going to be whittling you down every single round. But a couple of different approaches you could do here. For me, I went with Nidalee just to end the game as quickly as possible. Next up then, Celestial Guidance. So your Targon card costs 1 less to play, so just play Targon. Then Mana Flow, the foe gets an extra mana gem. So again, just making sure you're not playing one of the slower decks where you're going to get outpaced. So here you probably would want to focus on like Diana and not go for someone like Leona. Because Leona, since the enemy's getting that extra mana gem, would be more likely to get rushed down by the enemy. Whereas Diana, especially with that cost reduction, will still be able to end the game very quickly. Also going for someone like Yuumi, I believe she's the other Targon card, and she's also very strong for ending the games very quickly. Just wanted to make sure the enemy isn't outpacing you. So for this one, I did go for that Yuumi. Next up then, we had Arms Race, so the 2 Funsmiths, we saw this before. All your spells and skills deal 1 extra damage. So Annie, Jin, Misfortune, all good right here. Then Mana Flow, just saw this. You just want to make sure the enemy isn't outpacing you and rushing you down with that extra mana. So for me, I went ahead and used Jin. Next up then, Minimalist. Game start, the player starts with 2 extra mana gems, but doesn't get any more at round start. Then we have Vicious Enemy and Adorabus. Both powers you're very familiar with. Minimalist though, this is a very fun power in my opinion. And so you're really going to want to go for a champion that is able to put a lot of pressure on early, and you don't really care about having more expensive cards. You really want to be going for a champion where you're going to be playing all of your cards for that 4 mana or less, because you're not going to get any other mana gems the entire game. So when I see this, I kind of think that Samira is perfect for it, because especially with her cost reduction, she can make sure that all the cards she's playing is under that 4 mana. But really any champion that's able to end games quickly is great here. You could also play Jinx and just play her round 1, have her discard her whole hand and deal a ton of damage to the enemy. Really fun power and a lot of ways you can benefit from this. You just can't play those more expensive decks. So for this one, I actually went ahead and used Yasuo, which actually surprised me. I don't remember using that here. Next up then, Forced Workout. All units have strike double my power. Again, we touched on this before. Using any of these strike-based champions, especially putting on the strike relics of Gatebreaker and Stalker's Blade will really help you here. But if you can, just run Diana. She will obliterate the enemy Nexus. Blade in the Darkness, round end. If the player's Nexus took damage this round, the foe's strongest unit strikes it. Now note, this is if the player's Nexus took damage this round. So even if it gets damage from other effects, not necessarily the enemy attacking, they're still going to have their strongest unit strike it. So you want to be protecting your Nexus and make sure it's not getting hit at all. But if it does get hit, it's good to have a backup plan to deal with their strongest unit, make sure they can't hit your Nexus, so either frostbiting them or hitting them with a removal spell before the end of the round. For this one though, I used Diana, and this is where I figured out that she absolutely destroys that power. Up next then, Salty Dogs. Doesn't really need any explaining. Play Bilgewater. Sovereign's Domination. We've again touched on this before. You just want to make sure you're not having your strongest followers dying because the enemy is going to get them. Well, any of your followers dying. So avoid champions that are summoning units every round, and potentially avoid champions where they're relying on followers to do the damage for them, especially with their attacking, because they'll potentially end up working for the enemy. Now for this one, I used Pike. Next up then, Celestial Guidance. Targon cards cost less to play. Small stuff when the player summons a unit, set it to 1/1. Again, we touched on this earlier. A lot of ways to deal with this. You can try to scale up your units, or you can try to rely on units where you're not playing them for their stats, you're playing them for their effects or abilities. So especially like Jhin or Annie work out quite well here. Or some of the scaling decks like Leona and Bard, it's a little bit more risky, but it can still work for buffing people up. Also, I didn't think about it at the time, but I think that Yuumi would be great for this because normally her Poros already start at 1/1, and then you can just play attached cards on top of them, buffing them up to massive amounts. So I didn't think about it at the time, but I think Yuumi would be very good here. Prophet of an Elder God, we've already seen this a couple times when the foe attacks spawn 3. You just need to be mindful of the tentacle and trying to deal with it in your own way. So whether that's stunning it, frostbiting it, or trying to remove it. And then we have the Vicious Enemy, just making everything a little bit harder. Now for this one, I ended up going with Leona. Next up then, Unflinching Strength. Talked about this a bunch of times. Noxus cards cost less. Adorbis, again, we've seen this many times. This happens quite often in the weeklies. Just try to not focus on your followers because they will get silenced. For that one, I used Samira. Next up then, Embrace the Current. When the player plays a spell, they refill 1 spell mana. Again, we've touched on this before already. And you see that spell. Think about all the spells-based champions that we've talked about. They all are going to work out great here. Rock Too Hard. Round start, deal 1 to all the player's units. So this will obviously be amazing for Tahm Kench. Everyone else, you're just going to have to deal with a little bit of damage. And again, this is kind of putting a timer on you because all of your units are slowly getting weaker and weaker, unless you're playing Tahm Kench. If you can heal up your units though with like a Nami, then again, this won't bother you that much. For that, I did use Nami, worked out amazing. Next up then, Mercy Killings. Round end, kill all damaged units, so yours or the enemy's. Vicious Enemy, just making everything harder. Fan favorite, round start, give the foe's strongest units 2 power and overwhelm this round. And the Undying Rage. Yeah, this one was a pain. So Mercy Killings, you can try to benefit from that by damaging the enemy units so that they'll die. So for that power specifically, just trying to do a little bit of poke damage could be decent. So like Nami or Misfortune, they're good about getting a little bit damage on units, so that then they can hopefully just die at the end of the round. Fan favorite, we've talked about that before. Pretty general power, but you just have to be aware of it and make sure you can deal with the foe having a strong overwhelm unit. So either CCing that target so they can't actually attack, having a strong enough unit to deal with it, all of that would work. And then the Undying Rage, we've all seen this many times at this point, very annoying. This was a tough challenge. For that one, I ended up using Ashe, and it was fine. Not really amazing. Next up then, Chronicle of Ruin. talked about this at great length earlier in the video. Sovereign's Domination, again, we've already touched on this several times at this point. For this one, I went ahead and used Annie. Next up, Repetition. When any player plays a spell, copy it with the same targets. We touched on that one earlier. Any of the spells-based champions would be great. Vicious Enemy, just making everything harder. Then Chorus of Power. Round start, the foe gets an extra mana gem this round for each unit they have. Really powerful, just wanting to make sure the enemy doesn't have units, if at all possible. Normally this is one where I'm going to want to break out a pretty strong champion so we can end the game before getting overwhelmed. For this one, I used Vhagar. Next up then, we have Repetition again, Vicious Enemy again, and Sovereign's Domination again. All ones we just talked about. For this challenge, I ended up just using Vhagar again. Really like that Repetition with Vhagar apparently. Next up then, Blinking Flames. All spells and skills deal 1 extra damage. Touched on this earlier. Honestly, at this point, all of these we've already talked about. So for this, you want to be using a spells-based champion. Vicious Enemies just making everything harder. And then the Powder Monkey is just putting a timer on your game of you need to end before this kills you. So for this, I went ahead and used Annie. For 65, Forest Workout. Again, touched on this many times. Use Diana, she'll destroy, use a strike champion, otherwise Vicious Enemy, and then Nature's Revenge. Okay, a new power, at least for this video. When the foe gains the attack token, they summon a sapling. So you see that right here. Important to note, this has Challenger. Now, this can counter some of your decks if you're using some of the weaker champions, such as Annie or Teemo, because they'll be able to consistently have a Challenger unit that's going to try to kill your champion. This is a fairly strong power that they can use in a lot of different ways, either dragging your more important units aside so that you can't block with them, or killing some of your units as well because of that Challenger. This really just makes it so you don't want to play any weak units because this will kill them. So Annie, Teemo, any of the cheaper champions, or just decks that rely on cheaper units, probably want to stay away from this. For this challenge though, I ended up going with Garen. Next up then, Power of Observation. So game start, all players summon a Hex Tech Observatory. So you see that right here. Each round, the first time you play a spell, refill mana equal to my cost. So again, good for a spells-based champion, but not necessarily one you need to only do for a spells-based champion. Most decks, well, all decks have spells in them, and so the freedom of playing one spell is set essentially for free each round. It's something you can use on pretty much any champion. Vicious Enemy, just making everything harder. Welcome to the Murder Bridge, very much putting a timer on your game because they're just going to summon those increasingly more powerful champions. Really don't underestimate this one. It really is a pain. You might want to consider a champion that destroys this or just try to end the game as fast as possible. And then remove the imperfection. When the foe summons a unit, recall one of the player's followers with less power than it. So this is one where you really want to be having strong units. So either a deck that's constantly scaling up or one that just has strong enough units that you're not likely to get recalled. Now this is only going to target followers, so if you're focused on your champions, you don't have to worry about them getting recalled. Now there is potentially a way you can make this go to your benefit if you have some units that have a strong play effect. You can intentionally let them get recalled. So for Annie, she is the one unit that when you play it, you can stun an enemy, or if they're already stunned, deal like 4 damage to it. So getting that recalled wouldn't be bad, as one example. But generally you just want to have a scaling deck where you're not going to deal with your units getting recalled, or just focus on playing a champion since they can't get recalled. So for this challenge, I ended up using Talia. I think I did that because I wanted to destroy the Murder Bridge. Next up then, we have the Crackshot Corsair. Again, touched on that many times. Essentially use Annie or Jhin. Vicious Enemy, making everything harder. Calling for aid. At the start of round 7, the foe summons a random level 2 champion. So really you're just trying to end the game before that 7th round. There's a lot of powers that you really just need to look at it as a clock. These things are going to happen. You just need to end the game before it kills you, and this is just one of those powers. So for this one, I used Jhin. Next up, No Looking Back. Touched on this before, kind of a useless power, not really worth intentionally going for. Vicious Enemy, just making everything harder. And then Mana Leak. When the player plays a spell, create a fleeting copy in the foe's hands. Now, very interesting power. Now notice that if you have any cost reduction on that spell, the cost reduction does not go to the enemy. So you can keep playing your spells, and if the enemy doesn't have mana for it, you don't have to worry. This is just something you need to be very careful with while you're playing. Normally, when you play a spell, you want to make sure the enemy doesn't have mana to play that spell right back at you. And then often you don't want to be playing CC or removal spells unless you know the enemy doesn't have mana. Now you are creating a fleeting copy, so it's going to go away at the end of the round. So normally you just want to be playing your spells to kind of be the last thing you play if possible. One thing you can do that's kind of funny is you can play draw cards so that the enemy will keep drawing and they can almost end up running out of cards. That's almost how I won in one of these matches. I was playing Echo. Echo has ways of putting more cards back in his deck. So even though I was drawing a bunch of cards, I wasn't running out, but the opponent kept playing my draw cards, my predict and draw one as well, and they were getting close to running out. By the end of the game, they had less than 10 cards. Anyways, for this one, yep, I did play Echo here for 69. Nice. We have the Chronicle of Ruin. Round start, kill all units and revive them. Again, touched on that many times. Vicious Enemy, just making everything harder. Prophet of an Elder God, and the Undying Rage. So really, we've touched on all of these, and they're all just making the game much more difficult. I ended up completing this one with Evelyn, and actually it worked out surprisingly well. Last up, Final Adventure. Salty Dogs. Your Bilgewater cards cost 1 less. Vicious Enemy, everything harder. Mana Leak, we touched on this pretty extensively just 2 challenges ago, and then Suffer. So this is a more powerful version of the power we've seen before. So now it's a round start, deal 3 damage to all the player's damaged units. Before it was 1 damage. Important to note that for Tahm Kench, his star powers is when you take damage, you're granted 2/2. So just know that if you're playing Tahm Kench, this is slowly whittling you down. You can put some Berserker's Buckles on Tahm Kench to make him still come out of this on top, but all of your units will be going down. Also, 3 health is a lot, especially since you're already damaged. So this is just gonna flat out kill a lot of your units. You have to be very careful when you're playing, and there's a lot of blocks that you're not going to want to take, because even though you could block it easily, if you take any of that damage, then you're going to suffer the consequences. So this one, much more deadly than the version we saw before, and something you really need to take seriously. For this though, I went with Jack, and it worked out quite well. Alright, that was all of the monthly challenges. I hope this was able to help you out. I know some of the modifiers are pretty straightforward, but I know there's a lot of people that are kind of anxious about next month's challenges, and so I just want to show you what some of the mutators are, and so you can already be thinking about how you would deal with them. I know that there are some mutators that I touched on, and you probably like, oh, I have this whole other idea about how to beat it. And that's great. There's a lot of different ways you can beat these. I know that the suggestions I have for these, while they work, is not going to be the only way that you can deal with these, but I hope this got you thinking about how you would deal with these situations. Every one of these challenges is essentially just a puzzle for you to figure out how to best approach it. So I hope this video is able to help you for next month's monthly challenges, and I will also be doing guide videos breaking down next month's challenges as well. So if you want to see those, definitely like and subscribe. Again, big shout out to all my wonderful members. I hope you all have a great day.